Yes. So your real audience today, George and Deborah, are those 1,636 kids, because every teacher here will, in some way, share with them what we learn from you. The ripple effect of the masterclass is real. So thank you so much, George and Deborah, for being here with us today. Thank you to all of my fellow teachers for teaching. And of course, thank you to the Academy for Teachers for bringing us all together. And with that, I will turn it over to Sam to begin the class.
Thank you, Kevin. That was lovely. Am I unmuted? Yes. Okay. Hi, everybody. Okay, so we're going to start off with Rebecca Crawford, who teaches 11th and 12th grade IB Language and Literature at the Borough High School for International Studies.
Thank you. Yes, so my question is, the rough draft of Ghouls almost seems as much of a thought experiment as a story in some ways. And so I'm wondering, for George, how much of the richness of the eventual story and world was already in your head somewhere when you wrote out the rough draft? And then for both of you, how did you work together to develop the thought experiment into a story?
Well, thanks. That's such a perceptive question, Rebecca. I will say none of it existed in my mind at all, not a bit. I had done the audio recording of Civil Warland, my first book in LA, and I had sort of like you know, you sort of, with an old book, you sort of write it off like, oh, that's the old me. But then reading it, I was like, oh, that's kind of fun. You know, there's still something to be done there. So my resolution was just to try to goof around like that again. And the way I wrote the story was just really to sit down one day and say, okay, you have permission to go back into that Civil War land mode, you know, make up a theme park. And really, as strictly as I can do it, I just try to fart around, you know, just try to have fun, make some jokes. It's a little bit like thinking, okay, if there's a squatting ghoul, what's surrounding him, but real playful. That's the thing. And then in that mode, things just get blurted out, you know, and a lot of them just get cut later. But the goal there is to write kind of from an overfull place, a kind of comic riff. And I know that later I'm going to go back in and, you know, extremely clean it up and pick stuff out. But my wife was a student of Toni Morrison's, and she said that when she was starting a novel, the trick was to make a really deep, messy foundation. Don't worry about it. You're making a big mess, and don't let that voice that says, oh, this will be hard to clean up, sound in your head. Just make the mess. And I think Tony's idea was the deeper the foundation was, the higher the building could go afterwards. So that was just the goofing around, really. Just, you know, yeah, that was it.
To dive, I'll say, Rebecca, I wasn't responsible for getting from that first draft to the next version because George, the first time I saw that first draft was for today.
Yeah.
George, the draft that I received is the one that I worked on, and I guess what you got last night, the Word file with track changes. So it was not so far from the final published version. But I'll tell you that those things were in George's head. He just hadn't got to them yet.
Right. That's true.
And in terms of honing the piece later, I find, I don't know, George, maybe you can speak to that, because I approach it in an instinctive way when I'm reading, and I think about if a line has given me something or not given me something, or created questions that then aren't answered, or, you know, sent me off in a sort of on the wrong track, or else bored me. You know, I've heard this already. It's time for something different. And so I edit as a reader in that sense.
Yeah. And actually, you know, Deborah, she says she didn't help me from the early ones later, but I have her internalized, and I really don't like being rejected by her. So that means, you know, for me, it means doing a lot of early work to make sure that when we get to work together, the problems that we're solving are high level problems. You know, there shouldn't be any low hanging fruit by that time. It should be high. And then what happens is that, you know, I've been inside that world for so long that I just assume every word is perfect and it's all clear. And then Deborah coming to it as a high powered, very generous reader that she is, will help me see that I didn't communicate this clearly, or this part is a little mushy. So it's an incredible gift, you know, to work with her.
Thank you.
Right. Next up, we'll have Emily Dosher. I hope I've said that right, who teaches middle school and high school English at Community Health Academy of the Heights. Emily.
Yeah, Emily Dosher. This is a little bit similar. So this is for both George and Deborah. George, in your interview with Deborah in the New Yorker about Ghoul, you said you were worried about doing Q&A because you weren't sure what the story means or what it's a metaphor for. So what directed your initial revision as a writer, and then what later directs revision with an editor when you aren't sure what a story means or where it's going?
Sure. Yeah, well, for me, it's I looked it up, and this was started in May 2019 and just finished about 2 months ago. So it was a long process. And for me, the goal is to not know what it's about as long as possible, because then what happens is if you know what it's about, you're already refusing some positive energies the story's trying to give you because it doesn't fit your agenda. So for me, it's mostly a matter of just knowing, like as Deborah said, I'll get to a certain line and go, I've heard that before, or, oh, that's clumsy, or that isn't funny. And so the weird thing is if you just go through a manuscript 1,000 times like that, making micro adjustments each time to ear, basically, I would say, then the thing will start to mean. And in this case, I just want you to go through on an experience, have an experience. And I don't really know what the experience spits out at the end, but I know from having worked on it so long that it couldn't be too much different than what it is, you know? So this is different. When we teach a story, I think we tend to infer some intentionality on the part of the writer. But from my point of view, the intentionality is to be kept at bay as long as possible, because if you let it in, it will shrink what you're doing somewhat, you know? So I couldn't say why, you know, Deborah and I always do a lot of edits up to the last minute. And as I'm doing that, the story starts to be more precise and the character is there more, but I could never say why exactly. It's just he's coming out of the stone a little better with this line as opposed to that line.
Deborah, do you have any comments on that?
I guess, you know, when we do, every week, whoever edited the story in the magazine that week tries to do a Q&A with the author about the story. And, you know, sometimes, in fact, I try to do it fairly early in the process. I try to write my questions fairly early in the process, because they also tell me what questions I'm asking about the story as I'm working on it. So in this case, I had various things that the story evoked for me. And one was, you know, a sort of Stalinist or Maoist culture in which people inform on each other. And what creates that kind of environment. I also had, I don't think I told you, George, I had the Truman Show, you know, the guy in the middle of a world that is sort of bouncy and happy, or meant to be, who discovers it's not what he thinks it is. And these various sort of like competing ideas of what the story could be meant to make me think of.
Yeah.
And so it's incredibly refreshing for George to say, I wasn't thinking of any of those things. You know?
No, but I was. I mean, I think what happens is you see the Stalinist angle, and then you say, well, why do we need an anti-Stalinist satire? So then you try to push back on that. You try to make that recede a little bit. And then another, like, for example, I was thinking of Zadie Smith's story that was in the New Yorker maybe a year ago it was like an internet, I can't remember the name, but maybe you know it.
Yeah, the one with the arrows and the, you know.
Yeah. So that was on my mind. And so you let that in, and then you push that back a little bit, you know. I think the main thing, you know, it occurs to me to say about this process is that it's so much more intuitive than you might think. And so when I'm teaching my grad students, that's something I always try to emphasize, is that, you know, we tend to talk in thematics and allegories and all that, but actually the creation process is much more interesting, because it is, as Deborah said, it's totally intuitive. You make a cut. Why? Well, you can dress it up, but in fact, you just felt like it, and it somehow seemed more intense, you know, or whatever word you want to use. And the weird thing is that, at least in my experience, that kind of intuition does lead to something that has theme and character and all that. But it also, the idea is to be kind of a wild ride, and, you know, to mean not to be, I think. So, yeah.
I find in general that like George, most writers don't respond particularly positively to the question, is this an allegory for something? Mm-hmm. Because in their minds, it's the story they've written. And whatever allegory you want to find, that's for the reader to find, in a way. And if the story speaks to you about something else, it's all the more resonant. But that's your discovery.
Yeah. And sometimes the story doesn't cooperate. Like for me, the big moment in it, and I think it's maybe even a little bit in that first draft you saw, it's certainly in the third draft, I looked it up today, the moment where Tom Frame says something negative and then there's an awkward silence. And that just spoke to me. There's something funny about it, you know, where he blurts that out. So then you follow that down the rabbit hole, and it is kind of about Stalinism, or that tendency. So that's for me, a lot of the struggle of the story was to say, okay, but what else do you have to say? You know, what else are you about, or what other energy do you have? And that just takes, for me, just a ton of revision, you know, a ton of moving things around and cutting things, and resurrecting old jokes that I cut 3 months ago and putting them back in, but almost none of it on the conceptual level, I would say, you know, just getting up every morning and reading it and seeing which line offends me and which one still makes me happy, and doing that over and over and over again.
That awkward silence line is kind of it's the turning point in the story. And
Yeah.
you know, it's the first moment that the reader says, oh, I don't know what's going on. Why
Right.
did that create a really uncomfortable situation? And then it sets everything in motion. So.
And from the writer's point of view, when you get a line like that, you can't take it back. You know, you can't say, well, I don't want to write about Stalinism. You have to say, well, I just made a little pop, you know, so I better stick with it and see what it has to tell me.
Well, on that, there's Sarah Phipps, who teaches second grade at St. Anne's School, has something quite specific to ask about the versions. Sarah, are you there? Are you muted?
I'm there. I just lost the document. Okay, I'm going to have to read it off my phone. My apologies. So, Deborah, I was thinking that a big part of what you must do with a story like this is sort of probe the alternate reality that George has created. And George, I was wondering if there were any key moments you remember when Deborah helped you make an important adjustment that better supported the reality you had created. If there was a moment where, like you were saying, that you weren't quite, you thought you had communicated or you thought it lined up, but she pointed something out and you were like, oh, right.
Yeah. No, there's a one right at the beginning, and it seems small, but actually with a story like this, I mean, I'm sure the way you experienced it was, your first reaction is, what the hell is this? This isn't, you know, it's I can't process this. So, and the theory is you start off with that, with the reader and the writer far apart from each other, and the reader slightly resentful, you know, at this high concept thing. And then I'm supposed to try to woo you over to this thing, so that at some point you're like, oh, this is actually about my life. This is about my mind, you know, okay. So for that to happen, that entryway has to be immaculate, because by the time you get halfway down the page, you're almost ready to bail anyway and go watch a movie or something. So there was a place there where I'd always said, he's on break. It's break. I'm going on break. And I had just assumed that everybody knew that meant he was on break for a while, for a couple of weeks or a week or something like that. And in an early draft, Deborah said, no, actually, I had carried in my mind the idea that he was on a short-term break. And then when I get to this point later on page 3, it threw out of the story. So what we did was we just said break week. And suddenly that makes that hallway, you know, hopefully somewhat cleaner. So I don't want you to stub your toe on the entrance, you know, before you get to the really hard part. So that was just one example of probably 30 or 40 in the story where, you know, she was helping me ease the way, I guess.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Deborah, what do you see as the role of the editor? How do you look at your job?
I guess my job is to figure out what the story is, and then to see what elements of it aren't quite on the surface yet, aren't quite coming through. So my job is to read the writer's intention and make sure that the story lives up to it.
Yeah.
Okay.
And you know, from my point of view, one of the beautiful things about what Deborah does is that, and this is where I think speaks to teaching, because I'm kind of in the same relation to my students as Deborah is to me. I teach grad students and I'm editing their work and trying to be very frank with them and very precise. And what I've learned from working with Deborah is the best stance is one that is rooting for the story 100%, you know, that really wants it to succeed. And when we work together, we've been working together many years. I just don't have any defensiveness with Deborah at all. I know she's on my side and that we're working on the same project. And so that means I think we have a really high level of communication about nuances. And if I want to propose something crazy, I just do it. And if she wants to push back, she just does it. And if I want to push back, I do it. So that, to me, with my students, I always try to remember to lead with positivity first. So 3 parts criticism, no, 3 parts praise, and then maybe a half a part criticism or something. That way they can hear the specific advice, you know. So I've definitely, and then just that feeling that somebody is on your side, you know, that's for me has been really powerful as a writer.
Yeah, I think the best, somebody once said that the best comment they ever had from a teacher on their writing was in the margin, "Great job."
Yeah, yeah. It's
Well, I taught creative writing class for a year, and it was so hard, um, hard for me because in my job, if I think a story isn't strong enough or can't be made strong enough, I just say no. Um, and in teaching, I had to find some way to help those stories, some way to be helpful for a writer, who was not, who hadn't got to the level that I was used to doing.
mm,
And I put in hours, um, because it's very difficult to, I mean, it's difficult to teach. I pity you all, but it's difficult to find ways to take someone from one level to the next level,
yeah, yeah,
and to make them aware of what's happening with the writing. So leading with positivity gets you an ear, gets you a hearing, but then you have to figure out what to say
yeah.
to make something better.
Yeah.
And that usually it was a revelation for me to teach because it wasn't a way I'd had to think before that.
Yeah. Yeah. The one thing I do at Syracuse is I kind of tend to do mostly line edits. And then after I've done the line edits, then I'll kind of know better the 7 or 8 things I want to say, and so that it tends to be really in the same way that we're talking about, very much line to line, low concept kind of, hitting the lines. And then at some point it'll be clear that there is something intelligent to say about the story based on the line edits. Whereas when I first started teaching, I was always coming at it from outside, sort of conceptually, the father seems to represent patriarchy. Yeah. But with the line edits, you don't have to get into all that stuff. You just, make it better step by step. And then sometimes something is clarified. So that's something I think I've taken from our work together, Deborah, is that, every story is deep and every story is about something, but sometimes you have to kind of come in through the side door by making it do what it's doing better line to line, and then it'll kind of reveal itself.
And sometimes asking questions is good. I mean, just asking what is this paragraph doing in this story? What do you want it to be doing? Is enough to send the writer onto the right path with it.
Yeah, yeah. The other beautiful thing that happens with the New Yorker is that I don't know if Deborah, if you use this phrase, but at some point somebody said to me, well, we have to honor magazine pace. So when you have a story that you think is pretty tight at 28 pages, and then just seeing it in that New Yorker font, any little repetition is offensive and scary because people are going to read it. And just that idea that the short story form is such a minimalist venture. It really rewards brevity. It really does. And it doesn't like repetition or underscoring. And so that's always fun I always think of it as we shrink wrap the stories. And then by the end of the process, it's like, I feel like my vision gets so fine that, we're like talking over a little, that little thing about the duck on page 8. Yeah, it should go. Yeah, it should go. Just like that kind of shrink wrapping is so fun.
That was my favorite part of the story.
Yeah, no.
I love that.
That was a different duck we took out. That one you wouldn't have liked.
Along this line, Jeff Fisher, 12th grade teacher of rhetoric and media studies at Birchwood and Lenox, has something I think relevant to what you were just saying.
Hi, thank you. When revising and rewriting, this is for both George and Deborah, did you have a conception of an audience for the piece? Was there a George Saunders reader or a New Yorker reader or any kind of ideal reader you kept in mind? And did an idea of the audience factor into your decision that the piece was complete?
Deborah, you want
me to? I don't edit with that in mind. Partly because, we have more than 1 million readers. I don't know which of them are reading the fiction and which aren't. And they're all different. And one thing I have learned is that no story is going to please every reader, right? Some people are going to like George's work. Some people are going to say, I can't understand a word of this, and move on.
Wait a minute. What do you mean? Wait, go back.
And so once you're editing to please an imaginary person whom you don't know and whose tastes you don't know, I think you're doing the story a disservice. I mean, it really has to be, we've decided we're committed to this story. We're going to make it the best it can be on its own terms. And that's that. But George, maybe you're thinking of somebody when you write. Paula?
No, well, Paul, yeah, my wife she's always kind of the first reader, but I'm thinking about, I always say this, but it's like, there's a meter in my head and positive is here and negative is here. So I'm trying to just read the story as if I didn't write it and if I'd never seen it before, and just be real honest about what that meter is doing, you know? So if it's up in the positive, that's great. But maybe the one skill I've learned over the years is to be really aware of the micro inflections. So if you get to a certain place and it dips just a little bit, kind of saying to yourself, okay, we don't have to lie about it. You know, why did it dip there? And then making a change, and all that happening just in a split second. You know, so I think the audience is me, somebody with exactly my standards and my idea of fiction, but if I hadn't read it before. So you could see craft really is just a process of trying to create a simulation of that guy in my head. You know, I can find him pretty easily now. And then this fail safe is just that I'm going through it so many times anyway, that, you know, I think this one had 108 differently numbered drafts, but it was probably 3 times that in terms of passes through it. So by that time, you're checking those decisions thousands of times, you know. So I think there is a reader, but it's me, which means that I think highly of my reader. You know, I want to please myself. So that hopefully communicates some respect. And when we do the kind of editing we're doing, I always think we're trying to spare you the stupid stuff, you know, we've worked through the most efficient version of it, and therefore the writer and the reader are in communication as equals, you know, something like that. So.
Rob Erickson, 8th grade humanities and drama teacher at Junior High School 54, Booker T. Washington.
Okay. Okay, so as this is unmistakably a Saunders story told using Saunders strategies, is there ever a worry about how certain choices might be too reminiscent of other stories? Meaning, is there ever a concern that George Saunders sounds too much like George Saunders?
Yes, continually. And then on the other side, there's a worry that you will try so hard not to sound like yourself that you won't sound like anybody, you know? So for me, I think the trick is to sort of confess, like, okay, this story is meant to sound something like the ones in Civil Warland. It's maybe a familiar sound. Then you say, okay, what can I do to vary it? You know, to sound like myself, but not repeat myself. That's really what a lot of the editing is about. And increasingly, as you get older and you've done more stories, you're looking for the branch point where your habitual choice is to go left so that you can go right a little bit. In this story, one of the things that kept me interested was that I didn't really know if I was supposed to like this guy or not. You know, he's kind of a murderer. You know, he's kind of a sheep. And so it was interesting to me to be advocating for a person who was doing bad things. That felt like a little bit new for me, you know. So absolutely. And I think in fiction, everything is a potential problem. And the best thing is to admit it. Like you're writing a book about Lincoln. That's a problem. You know, you can't do that. Then you say, okay, well then let me avoid the landmines. And in avoiding the landmines, maybe do something a little new, if that makes sense.
We have a process question from Michael Guarnieri, if I have that pronounced right. English and Creative Writing at Claremont International High School. Michael, please.
Thank you. I'm just curious about how you start and if you ever use something in the way of like an outline or a plan before you start writing or during the process at any point.
Usually I don't. I know writers who do, but for me, except Lincoln, I had a little bit of an outline, but for a story like this, I really am just kind of free writing. Hoping for one good joke or line or image or something. And then that thing, if it's good enough, I start polishing it. And then once it's really polished, then it happened, you know, and then the story reacts to it. So it's really a little more like crossing a stream, and you've got some boulders. So you throw one down and step on it, and then the next one, and then you're out of boulders and you wait for one to appear, you know. So it's on short stories, it's really very much intuitive and improvisational. And then the only thing that happens over the years is that I understand that that's actually a reliable approach, but you can just improvise all the time, and the story will begin reacting to itself. So it feels relatively safe.
Brooke Zelser teaches English at Northern Valley Regional High School in Old Tappan, I think you told me is how you pronounce that.
At Old Tappan. Yeah, my questions are for Deborah. Who is the most challenging writer? And also, what is the most challenging piece you've ever edited and why? And how easy or difficult is it to edit George?
I'm gonna start at the end.
Yeah. And maybe we'll run out of time.
George is just total pleasure to work with because he's so responsive and because he wants the input. And that is true of most of the people that I work with. In many cases, I'm the first reader on something and they don't want to put something out that isn't good, that isn't strong enough. They want to hear what's not working so that they can fix it. So it's actually, I mean, I know it's not the images of, an editor who just cracks down and tears your piece apart and puts it out at, a tenth of the length and so on. That's not what happens, at least in this particular department. So once in a while, there are a few writers out there who I know they've sat with something for so long before sending it to me that they can't break up with it. They are so wedded to it that changing a line or something, anything, a word, might throw off this, they worry it might throw off this whole edifice that they've structured so carefully. And so it feels threatening. So I know a few writers like that. Not very many. And in those situations, knowing that that's the feeling that they have, if I think a story needs a fair amount of work, I don't take it. No, it's not going to happen. So with those writers, I will take a story, that I think is very close to working as it is. On the other hand, some people are just full of bluster. I'll send a proof which I think is fairly light, and they'll say, no, you don't understand, you don't get it, and then we'll talk through it slowly, and they'll end up taking 3/4 of what I marked. So with some people, it's just adjusting the vision of the story and coming around to it as a reader, from my perspective, and rather than as the creator of it. So I don't know what's the most difficult thing I've ever edited. That's a good question. I don't have an answer. Let me think about it. We can come back to it at the end if I think of something.
Deborah, maybe you could tell everybody how the process of selecting stories works at the New Yorker.
Well, I wanted to actually come back to the earlier question about when is Saunders too Saunders, and do you discount a story if it's too much like what someone has done before, and which led me to thinking about how we approach stories from the same writer over time, and I guess my idea has always been that you don't do a writer any favors by publishing their sort of B-list stories. If I get a story by, I don't know, Alice Munro, say, and it's just not as good as the usual Alice Munro story is, like there's just something a little bit missing, I feel I don't do her any favors by putting that story out in the world. And if I say no to it, she might, or whichever writer it is, might then take another look at it and wonder why and think about it. And often it happens that I get a revision back after that initial conversation, which takes it to the next level. at the same time, I'm quite aware that a B-list Alice Munro story is going to be better than, you know, an A-list story by another writer, you know, who, so, and which I would publish. So it's sort of, I feel that writers are really only competing with themselves, right? So they are competing, as was discussed, not to do exactly the thing they've done before, to do something different, or to do the same thing better, to do, you know, to sort of work against and work by challenging themselves. So I don't know. Now I can't remember what question you asked me to answer, because I wanted to come back. What was your question?
That was just a general question about how story submissions work at the New Yorker.
Yeah. So there are two other, well, actually 3 other people who edit stories. One is the sort of coordinator of the department, who was my assistant, has been somewhat promoted, and 2 other editors. And we all also edit nonfiction. So it's not, we're not full-time. There's sort of a Venn diagram of editors who edit fiction and nonfiction, editors who edit only nonfiction. And we're all being sent material all the time, and we're all reading all the time. And if something seems to be of a level where we should discuss it as a group, that gets circulated among us. So we always have about, I don't know, 10 or 12 stories that are kind of in circulation in the department. And then once a week we sit down and talk about them, and people write opinions of them and email those around. And sometimes it's just yeah, it's not quite there, it's not quite working. Sometimes it's this is amazing. More often it's, these little things could be fixed and this could be a better story, and it's worth trying to get it there. And yeah, that's basically our process. There isn't at the point where I decide, yes, we want to take the story, whether we're going to work with it or not, we want to take it. I then run it by David Remnick, the editor-in-chief, and 99% of the time he signs off.
Well, the questions that were submitted in advance, you've answered them in one way or another in the questions you've covered so far. So we're going to open it up to the floor and let people chime in. And I think we can trust each other not to step on each other's voices here. I don't think we need to do chats. So I think you're supposed to count to, oh, there's one. Yes, Brooke.
Okay, thank you. George, I just wonder, I know you have a book on Russian writers coming out soon. I've been lucky enough to teach Chekhov in my creative writing class, and I was finally able to make a connection between Chekhov and some of your stories, in that Chekhov's, I'm sure you know that his statement about art was that his holy of holies is complete freedom for the individual, and the ability to sort of evolve and pursue their own happiness or whatever they can. And I'm wondering if that ever crosses your mind. It seems to me that a lot of your characters are stuck between like the Ken Kesey combine that you see in like Cuckoo's Nest, and that wanting to like evolve fully, like a Chekhov would have people do.
Right.
Just wondering if that ever, if you ever made that connection yourself.
Well, I like that connection a lot. The thing I was really struck by in finally writing about him was, and it's something I don't think I do very well, and I aspire to. So that was a nice gift of writing about him. And that's just that he can take an idea or a position, have a character embody a position, and you think, yeah, that's it. And then somebody else will come in and occupy a different position. And then Chekhov just walks off the stage, leaving those two contradictions resonating. And I think that takes so much moral, ethical confidence. And so I'm trying to work on that in whatever way it makes sense for me to do that. I think I tend to have I do as a person have pretty simple moral beliefs. And I think what I see modeled in Chekhov is somebody who has various intense moral beliefs that are at war. And so somehow the result of that is really rich, so that sort of ambiguity that he programs in very, technically with structural things and that. So that gave me a lot to think about. And I can feel, even just having written that book for the last 2 years, a lot of this stuff is sinking into my artistic body a little bit, and starting to get interesting. So which stories of his do you teach?
The Huntsman,
mm-hmm.
what's the name? I didn't teach this one last year, but there's a story about an artist who sort of like takes advantage of this a young girl, and he uses her as a model. I also teach Vanka, Sleepy. Did I mention The Huntsman? I think I did. The Huntsman. Yeah. Really the short ones, because it's a challenge to teach Chekhov to high school kids, so I have to sort of keep them short.
Well, I in the book I wrote about three of them, but one is Gooseberries, and that's Gooseberries really does this thing of it's kind of a meditation on happiness, and people feel differently about it, and there are different beautiful arguments made about whether we should strive to be happy or not, and it's just an incredibly complex work of art, and it's part of a trilogy called the About Love trilogy, and way back when a Syracuse student, Tobias Wolff, our teacher, was going to give a reading, but he had a flu or something, so he decided to read Chekhov instead of his own work, and he read that whole trilogy, and it was just a mind, I think it was the first time I ever understood that humor could be really high art, maybe the highest form, and just because of the way Toby read it.
Cool. I also teach some of his early comedy of manners stories, and I sometimes show Seinfeld episodes to sort of like make that connection, like this is what comedy of manners looks like today.
Oh, nice.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I know you spoke before about when you read something over, you're reading it to please yourself. So just, when you were beginning as a writer, were there strategies you used to improve that ear so that you were always becoming a better reader and writer?
Well, thanks, Michael. For me, it was more that I really had that ear all along. I knew that I liked Monty Python. There was no thinking about it, or some of the early Steve Martin things, and I knew I liked Isaac Babel, the Russian. So for me, the biggest thing was just finally admitting that very strong sense of intuitive taste was valid for literature. I was a working class person, so I put up a lot of conceptual constructs about what a story should be or had to be and all this crap. When I finally just started honoring the part of me that knew what it liked, then that was right there. It was very accessible and very easy to find. So with my students, I try to do that. Just to say that we make a lot of especially if we're insecure about writing, or our intellectual location, we make a lot of ideas about it. So if I find myself talking about theme or content or structure, I know I'm hiding a little bit. Those things are real, but I think we make a lot of constructs, and really we kind of know what we like. And so for me, it was just my students, it's a matter of encouraging them to do the thing about which they have the strongest opinions. That's reliable, I think. After they've read a bit, that's it's not just the, but assuming they've done some energetic reading, then they can do that.
Deborah, George, I'll jump in here. What would you like to see taught in high schools? What stories would you like English teachers to teach?
Just mine only.
Saunders all the time.
Yeah, I think.
Well, I'll say that now I can't find her on my screen. Kasumi Parker at Hunter was my older daughter's teacher one year, English teacher, and she taught a few New Yorker stories, and I'm curious as to why she picked the ones that she did. Are you there? You must be on.
Yeah, now I can try to think back. That was a couple of years ago now. The short stories that I taught included a story called Algorithmic Problem Solving and Father-Daughter Relationships. I don't think that's a worker story though. Now I'm trying to remember the others. Oh, Apollo is a New Yorker story by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. And I'm trying to think of what the other one was. That was a notable New Yorker story that I think we used. The reason why I taught Apollo is that a colleague of mine who's also in this Zoom, Caitlin Donovan, was like, "Have you read this story? It's great. I'm teaching it to 9th graders." And then I found that, yes, it also worked really well in terms of getting students to think about it's kind of a coming of age story in a way, and it's their own kind of sense of selves that's evolving. And I think that's what was powerful about that story, despite being in a place different from the students.
Any other questions for George and Deborah?
Rebecca, why don't you jump in?
I think you're muted, I think.
Great, cool, awesome. Thanks. So this is a problem that my students really struggle with as writers is this fear of the blank page. And I think that actually when they're doing their peer editing, they're struggling with a fear there as well of just feeling overwhelmed and not where to start. And like if they do anything, it will already not be perfect. And there's no amount of saying rough drafts are supposed to not be perfect, it's okay, or like critical friends are good friends. Like there's no amount of saying that to kids that's gonna really work. But it sounds from everything that the two of you have said over the past hour, I guess, is that you really have a handle on embracing that idea of just kind of going with it. And I was wondering if there was ever a moment for you, George, as a writer, and for you, Deborah, as an editor, where you just felt like there was a time in your life where you were like very unsure of how to start on a writing project or an editing project, and what advice would you give my students is what I'm asking. What would you tell them?
First, that it's a no shame space, right? I mean, rough drafts are made to be rewritten. And second, that if you have someone who's going to edit you, you have a safety net. That peer editor is going to tell you, oh, this is really embarrassing, change it, fix it. There's something there to catch you before you fall, right? And take advantage of it. And it's, over and over, I see stories, I see them, with people I work with a lot, I often see them long before they're ready. And it's not that I ever tell anyone how to shape something, but I can say, go back to page 5 and start over, because you don't know where you're going here. And they can restart so that and it doesn't mean I think suddenly they're terrible writers. I think everybody gets stuck sometimes. And, if you can find some great famous examples of writer's block or people, often I thought it was fascinating. I was reading recently a piece about Toni Morrison's apartment and her book collection, which someone had gone through and found that she had gone through her novels and like edited them in the printed final copy, had made changes and noted things. She couldn't stop, right? She looked back on something she'd written 10 years ago and it wasn't perfect. And life is like that. And I look back on things I edited 10 years ago or 20 years ago, and I think, why didn't I fix that? I missed it. It just didn't resonate in that way at the time. Yeah. So it's never going to be perfect. I guess that's the best thing to say. So try for good.
I always found that if you find somebody with writer's block, that's somebody who doesn't have confidence that they can revise very well. And so with my undergrads, I always try to say, well, let's just edit somebody else's work, or actually, if you want, I can send this out after class. I have a overwritten piece of prose, 600 words. And there's a really cool exercise where you give them 5 minutes to cut 10 words progressively. And you keep doing this over and over. And after each round, you say, okay, why did you cut what you cut? And is the result better or worse? And they always conclude it's better, of course. And then you just keep doing this until it gets down to half its original length. And then even more than that if you have time. And what you find is you eventually will get to a place where you have to start deciding what the piece is. But then they take that that slasher, impulse that they trained on my work, and they go and work on their own stuff. So I think if somebody really knows that they can rewrite, it doesn't bother them to do a shitty draft, because I feel like I could take anything I wrote and make it better. I just, if I got writer's block, I would literally just type a bunch of nonsense and then find one little thing. So I think that's why people, lock up that fantasy that a writer is somebody who can produce a beautiful story in the first attempt. And I don't know anybody who really can do that. I don't think so, So
George, can I use an example from your life?
Please.
That 4 years ago, George wrote a nonfiction piece about rallies, Trump supporters and Trump rallies, and was in his normal mode. It was a different form of reporting and writing, and his first draft came in as a screenplay with like angels hovering above the rallies and things. And he had to write that in order to then see what is in here that makes sense as a piece of journalism, and then pull those things out,
Yeah, and that was really, it was funny because I was so stuck. And I think David said very, very diplomatically, it seems to me you're avoiding the difficult work of analysis, But I wrote that, I think it was a sort of a screenplay and an opera, and I was using actual quotes from Trump supporters, and it was a total mess. And I was so, actually, afterwards, so embarrassed at having sent that, because it was just ridiculous. I actually read it the other day, and it's really ridiculous. But as Deborah's saying, having thrown myself at that wall, I was, all right, I can't bullshit my way around this. I have to go back and do the real hard work and find a different mode. And I've gotten to the point, and I think in part because of the support that the New Yorker provides, and Deborah, my editor, I feel real confident that I can be a shitty writer, and she won't, she won't forget me. And so that, therefore I can work through those early shitty things into the, so I think my students often have the feeling that they are what they write. They are what they write the first time, but that's not even close. You're not even what you write after 8. I'm not this story, it's just an attempt. It's just a playful attempt,
To turn this around to back to, did you have something to say, Deborah? Was that you?
No, it was me. Kalia.
Kalia, please.
Sorry. Thank you so much for doing this. I guess and I would actually really love the revision exercise, because I think that's the thing my students tend to struggle with the most. And I think my question is more about just writing in general, and maybe also as an editor, Deborah could answer this, but is there ever a point where you're sitting with a piece and you just feel like it's not going anywhere, and that you have to let it go, even after it gets to Deborah's desk?
Mm-hmm.
George?
Yes. Yes. And the only thing I've ever learned is that if that's happening, it's, my mind tends to go, it's happening because you're no good. You don't have what it takes. You're an amateur, you're a faker. But to train my mind to go, no, what specifically is bothering you about this? When you say it doesn't work, what do you mean? And often, I find that some honest part of myself will blurt the answer out, whatever it is, it's too conceptual. It doesn't make sense. It's getting repetitive. There's something. Then, you can work with that. But I think often we jump off on that first track, I'm no good. And then we don't get to the diagnostic stuff, So if I get to a place where my story starts to repulse me, and that needle drops into the negative, sometimes I just sort of try to be real nice to myself. Like, oh, your story does kind of suck. You poor guy. You're supposed to be a pro, What do you think it is that's bothering you? And I might say, in reference to Robert's question earlier, I just sound like I'm imitating myself, And then the answer is, well, don't do that, So I think that moment you're talking about usually means the story is about to go deep on you, and it doesn't want you to. It's trying to make you stop. But if you frankly just say to the story, look, we're in this together. Can you please tell me what's bothering you? The story will often, cough up an answer. And even if, for example, let's say that you had a situation in the story that was implausible, And so you got to page 8 and went, this is stupid, it's implausible, I'm stuck. You could do like Gogol does in The Nose and just say, the reader may be thinking that this story is implausible. Once you did that, you kind of fixed it, you know, because so I think that's, for me, the fun of the writing job is that it's very, it's about your doubts about yourself as a person and how you can actually get those on the page and wrestle with them a little bit.
Thank
Michael,
you.
I believe you had your hand up earlier.
Yeah, I wanted to ask a question about the kind of like the corporate culture that's in the story and a lot of your other stories. And I think like the branding and the specificity of that is interesting to me. And so I'm just wondering what, what role, I guess, you hope for that to play, or kind of the function that you're thinking about as you're writing it, either for the story or in other stories.
Yeah, I don't really have an answer, Michael. I think I just like it at the time, and I feel like it's somehow good. Yeah, I don't know. It's sort of like, yeah, I think rather than answer it falsely, I just will kind of sidestep that one. I think mostly it's just you're at a certain juncture in the story. You need something. You need, in this case, I need some other theme parks. You know, you need some, I said there's 11 workhouses, so I have to come up with 10 other ones. Then at that moment when you're about to do it, it's such a quick, intuitive decision that feels to me more like stand-up than anything else. You're just like, what would be good? And maybe you blurt one out that's a little too familiar and you retract it. And then you blurt out another one and it's a little familiar, but you alter it and then it's acceptable. So I don't really have for sure don't have a master plan like about what the thematics mean or anything like that. You know, I had a little run-in with corporate life when I was younger, and so that stayed with me in terms of what it does to a person and what it does for a person and all that. But beyond that, I'm not sure that I really know. Sorry.
George, you're a master blurter.
Why, thank you for that. I'm going to put that on my gravestone.
But in the breakout room, Daniel had a question about the sadness in the story. Maybe you want to ask that, Daniel?
Well, it was, I think that it's been touched upon, the sadness, the desperation in it. And I wanted to, what I thought of often as I was reading it was I was thinking of Russell Hoban and Ridley Walker. I don't know if you remember that book from years and years ago, where he creates it's after the atomic bombs have destroyed the world and the world is coming back, and there's puppets and all this crazy stuff. And there's a language, and that's what made me think of Russell Hoban and Ridley Walker, that there's a language that's created. And it seemed so steeped in such a sense of, can't think of another word, sadness, not tragedy, but a deep, deep sadness. And it unfortunately was resonating from what's been going on in the world up till most recently. But yeah. I just thought that it was so striking and moving in a terrifying way, actually. So I just want to thank you for that.
Well, I don't feel that sad personally, although I think the world is messed up right now. But I think what my idea is that fiction has to have the really good and the really bad in it, the really happy, the sad, the really terrifying and the transcendent. They need to abut. Now in my work, it's not like Chekhov where it feels like the real world. It doesn't. But I think the idea is to put in some placeholders for depression, for loss and tragedy, and then put in some placeholders that work against that and see how they do, So I'm always surprised at how dark my stories turn out, but it's not really, it's mostly just because it's like if you were a really good blues player and you sucked at polkas, then you would be labeled a sad person because you played the blues. But in anything like that, the idea is that there's some joy in the overflow of the system. It's a dynamic system that you make, resonate. We've been watching Glenn Close on YouTube, and she'll kind of just do these weird little inhabitations of people that she makes up. And there's something in the joy of that that's you know, even if the person is sort of dark or depressed or weird, there's something about seeing her do that that's joyful, you know? So I think that's, I don't know, I'm not sure really. I think you're muted.
I just wanted to agree with that. That really it sounds right.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I had a question about the ending of your story. You said earlier that that you weren't sure you liked the main character. And then in the end, and also, I mean, I assume he dies shortly after the end of the story, so you killed him off. But he redeems himself in a way. I appreciated the ending because I saw it as some sense of whatever strange world we're in, you know, we could choose to try and make a change to it. And it's done in a very subtle way. It's not like really, it's like literally a paragraph at the end. It's not like something. So was there some point when you're like, this character, this guy grew on you a little bit as you were writing?
Yeah, I mean, he grew on me from the beginning. You know, I just found him he's like somebody who takes you to a party and then starts behaving badly. You're like, I don't, you know, I came here with him, but I'm not sure. But for me, a lot of that is just, honestly, to be honest, since we're among teachers, there'll be a moment where you feel the oxygen running out of the story. Like if it's say maybe at 25 pages, you're like, you know, this can't be 40. It's got to be 29. So then you're kind of feeling around, how do I get out of this thing? How, you know, and part of that is to say, well, why am I in it? Like what's at stake? What bowling pins have I put up in the air? And then at some point in an early draft, I just blurted out that sort of an ending, you know, that he straightens up, like he figures it out. He basically figures out the nightmare he's been living in. And then you're sort of steering toward it a little bit, you know, but at the same time, you're trying to leave open the idea that it could turn out really badly for him too. But in a story this made up, you know, where I'm really asking a lot of indulgence from the reader. I don't think it's that satisfying to then say, and then the shit continued to fall on him, you know. Somehow it's not fair because I'm making it all up anyway. So we're making a scale model of delusion, let's say, you know, a person who's in a system that he doesn't understand, and his idea of being morally correct is actually very wrong. So to just have him stay there feels a little static, and to allow him some way to get out of it might feel more active or something like that, maybe, you know. But I liked him since he, you know, since the first paragraph, really. But I did, then suddenly he was doing things I didn't approve of, I guess, you know.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question.
I was hoping you could talk a little bit about point of view, either or both of you, because it strikes me, George, that what you do with point of view seems magical, and it exists in the very initial draft as much as it exists in, say, 6 revisions, however many revisions down the line. But it's something that's perceptible even in a version that you showed to us but didn't submit to the New Yorker. So I guess I'm curious about the creation of point of view and what, if any, kind of revisions come along the line. To me, it's like, it almost feels supernatural to me as a reader, and also what really attracts me to your work. So I was hoping you could talk about it.
Oh, thanks. I think it goes back to that earlier thing where I'm really trying to write to the reader in an honest way, in the same way you would have a nice lunch. You know, we are not going to have a nice lunch if I'm just standing there performing for you. We're not going to have a nice lunch if I'm lying to you. You know, if I knock over my water glass and pretend I didn't, that's something wrong, you know? So I think part of it is you blurt something out, and then you go, you're sort of sitting there right with the reader going, look at that, huh? He's a squatting ghoul, what the hell? Then you kind of try to acknowledge all those little resistances that come up, you know? I think that's what makes the feeling of intimacy, is that, you know, you're kind of like in close connection with the reader and you're both looking at the same text with the same intelligence. Then when I lean left, you kind of come with me a little bit, something like that. Actually, I learned a lot. Deborah taught me something really important once. I had submitted a story that she did actually reject, and but with some amazing notes. And it was a story called Puppy that the magazine later ran. But there were 2 characters, 2 different points of view. And there was a working class woman and kind of a bougie woman. And I had really had a lot of fun with the working class woman. I really knew her diction, and I really went to town. And Deborah had pointed out to me that made an imbalance in the story. It was pretty, it felt like I was making fun of her a little bit. And so the note was, dial it back a little bit, bring her diction up. And at first I thought, oh no, I can't do that. It wouldn't be truthful. And then I thought, well, Deborah suggested it. So I did it, and it was amazing. Like suddenly to get that, the two people were suddenly on the same level, even though they didn't speak equally well. So that was an interesting thing. Point of view is a construction, you know, you do it with your diction, you do it with your syntax, you do it with your choices. And there's nothing magical about verisimilitude, you know, it's a dynamic system you're trying to make. Anyway.
Did you have anything to add to that, Deborah?
Well, my feeling, maybe I'm wrong, with George and with a number of writers, is that what comes first is the voice. What comes first is the diction. What comes first, especially in first-person stories, that comes before the story a lot of the time. And then when you have the voice can tell the story. So I don't think there was ever an option for another point of view in this story. I think the story is the point of view in a sense. And not every writer is like that. I just did a podcast about a William Trevor story where, you know, the point of view shifts every other paragraph, basically. It's not first person, so it's easier to do that. But, you know, you're diving in and out of people's heads in an interesting way. But it's not that one is easier or harder. There are different ways of writing stories. And I think it's about how the writer is positioning herself or positioning himself. Is the writer inside the story? Is the writer inside a character, or is the writer watching it? And you can write great stories both ways, but it has to be established at the beginning.
All right, well, we've come to the end of our time, and the lovely thing about these events is that the energy, the knowledge, whatever you want to call it, that's happened here today is going to go out to those 1,632 children somehow, and one of them maybe will send you a story, Deborah, and will be published in a future New Yorker. Thank you so much for doing your part for teachers and for students. And thank you, teachers, for what you do for the city of New York and New Jersey, I guess, an old tap band. We love you all, and we'll see you again next week. Thank you, George. Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you. Thank you, George. Thank you, Deborah.
Thank you.
Thank you.